Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers, and today, something a little different. We go to the deepest part of the ocean to talk about deep sea mining. Dr. Andrew Thaler, a deep sea ecologist and ocean educator, tells me all about what's happening in the field of deep sea mining, including what we're looking for, how it works, and the potential environmental impacts. We also discuss the law of the sea, a set of international laws that governs the use of marine resources. Let's listen. Andrew Thaler, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. How are you doing today?
I am doing just great.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what you're doing.
So I am a deep sea ecologist. My work orbits around how humans use and misuse technology to explore and exploit the deepest parts of the ocean. And so through that, I do a variety of different kinds of research programs, most of them surrounding deep sea mining, as well as microplastics in the deep sea. And I also run an environmental consulting firm where I consult on high seas policy, deep sea ecology, conservation technology, and education.
So let's talk about deep sea mining. Now, my understanding is that this is not something that is actually happening right now. Is that correct?
Yes and no. It is not currently happening at a commercial scale. No one is commercializing mining the deep sea. However, there are several countries that are engaged in experimental test mining, and there is an ongoing negotiation at the UN to develop the regulations that will ultimately allow companies and countries to commercialize the high seas, that is, the areas beyond any country's borders.
And tell us about what is deep sea mining? How does it work? What are we looking for?
So deep sea mining is really three separate industries. There is hydrothermal vent mining, there's cobalt-rich crust mining, and there's polymetallic nodule mining. Hydrothermal vent mining is essentially strip mining of a deep sea hydrothermal vent, which is these kind of large geologically active structures on the seafloor. Cobalt-rich crust mining is the comprehensive removal of the crusts that form around seamounts. But when most people talk about deep sea mining today, what they're talking about is polymetallic nodule mining. And polymetallic nodule mining is very different from the other two kinds of deep sea mining in that these nodules they're small rocks. They're about the size of potatoes. Where actually I don't know who originally described them as potato-sized, and I'd love to figure out where that original quote came from, but they are potato-sized rocks that grow on the seafloor. They do grow. They're very weird geologic structures. And they grow because heavy metals in seawater slowly over the course of millions of years come out of solution and are deposited on hard objects. Sometimes they're shark's teeth, but more often they're little tiny things like diatom tests and radiolaurin shells. But these polymetallic nodules are very rich in cobalt, and they're very rich in nickel, and they're very rich in copper, and they're extremely rich in manganese. And so there are several companies out there who are interested in exploiting these nodules for their value to particularly electric vehicle batteries and electrification of the world's energy infrastructure.
I was going to ask, what is the primary good that we're looking for here? It sounds like there's a number of things, but they're all kind of pointing towards one industry in particular.
They're generally associated with the renewable energy industry. Nickel is also very important for things like stainless steel production. Copper is obviously essential for all kinds of electrification projects. Cobalt and manganese have many other uses as well, but predominant value proposition for deep sea mining is for electric vehicle batteries.
Do you have an idea of how much stuff is down there compared to what we have in maybe more accessible places?
So at a polymetallic nodule field, globally, it's orders of magnitude more than what you'd see on the surface. So we are talking about a resource that is 10, 20, 100 times more rich than terrestrial sources. It is, of course, also much, much more difficult to access, and it's much more spread out. So polymetallic nodules grow across the abyssal plain, and that means that the area that we're talking about is 40 to 50% of the surface of the planet in the deep sea, in incredibly inaccessible regions, very diffuse. Like the polymetallic nodules aren't super concentrated in one area. They're spread out across large swaths of the seafloor. So when companies are talking about mining a polymetallic nodule deposit, they are talking about areas that are thousands of acres.
And where are these areas located? Is this in one particular ocean? Or you mentioned it's 40% of the Earth. Is it in one area or is it all over?
So it's ocean-wide. There are significant aggregations of polymetallic nodules in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, less so in the Atlantic Ocean because the Atlantic is a very young ocean. But the area that is currently being aggressively pursued for mining is a place called the Clipperton-Clarion Fracture Zone. And that's an area between Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast in international waters where there are particularly dense collections of these nodules that are particularly rich in especially cobalt and nickel.
How do you do deep sea mining?
So I don't do deep sea mining, but
how does one do this?
There are currently several different propositions for how to mine the deep sea. The most popular and common proposal involves using a tracked crawler, something that almost looks like a caterpillar bulldozer, but not with the bulldozer head, just with the tracks, that has a suction apparatus on the front of it that scoops or scrapes or sucks up the nodules into a hopper where they're then pumped to the surface. And we're talking about 6,000 meters depth. So these are giant robots operating very deep on the seafloor. There's another company that's talking about using kind of neutrally buoyant ROVs that sort of hover just over the seafloor and collect the nodules with collecting arms. And there's been a few other different proposals for how to do it. But essentially, it's always some form of very large robot that is moving across the seafloor and selectively or not so selectively plucking the nodules from the sediment. And what's really interesting about these nodules is that they're rocks. They're not like, when you look at like other kinds of mining deposits, the ore is like embedded in the crust of the earth. There's tremendous amounts of overburden that has to be removed. There's, you have to drag like a shovel head across a large area to scrape up what you need. But with polymetallic nodules, they really are just rocks sitting on the surface of the seafloor. And curiously with nodules, they don't sink into the sediment. You only find them right at the surface, and that kind of speaks to how they form and kind of the processes that keep them aggregating and growing. Because at the end of the day, these are rocks that grow, and that makes them very weird and very unique.
And I take it they can only grow in that location. We couldn't synthetically grow them somewhere.
I have no idea if they could be synthetically grown. I haven't seen any serious proposals that would be able to do that. It's kind of the unique physical properties of the deep ocean that allow these metals to come out of solution. And there may be, we don't really know exactly how polymetallic nodules form. There's lots of really good hypotheses, but we're not sure if it's a purely physical and chemical reaction or if there is a biogenic mediator, like microbes that are helping these things form. So those are all really interesting ecologic and physical and geologic questions that are still unanswered, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the deep sea is incredibly remote, incredibly inaccessible, and even today, we know very, very little about the processes that shape the deep ocean.
So I want to get to the policy side of this conversation, but before we do, let's stay in kind of the physical, how it's actually done. It sounds like there are some pros and cons to deep sea mining when you compare it with onshore mining. Can you talk through maybe some of the environmental factors and things like that?
Sure, absolutely. The major direct impact that we hypothesize from deep sea mining is in the formation of the plume. So when you're driving a large robot across the seafloor, when you're pumping tons and tons of ore to the surface, and when you're then dewatering that ore and returning that water back into the ocean, there is a chemically enriched plume that is created from that process. And that plume perfuses over a certain amount of area and settles out. And the impacts of that plume on the larger deep ocean ecosystem is not very well understood. We're getting increasingly better understanding of what that plume might do, but it's still not very well understood. And so, will that plume smother animals on the seafloor? Will that plume disturb the chemicals in that plume that are coming out of the nodules as they're pumped up to the surface and returned down? Will those chemicals change how biological processes happen on the seafloor? Those kinds of questions remain to be answered. When there's a dewatering plume, many of the proposals talk about releasing the dewatering plume in the midwater rather than back all the way down on the seafloor, because that's a 12,000 meter round trip. And so a dewatering plume released in the midwater, what kinds of impacts are those going to have on midwater species, especially like commercially important fish species? So there are a lot of environmental unknowns with that. There are some more direct impacts as well. Obviously, if you run a tracked crawler across the seafloor, the area immediately around that tracked crawler is going to be disturbed. Operation itself is very noisy, so animals that are sensitive to noises, like marine mammals, like cetaceans and other marine mammals that need sound and use sound to navigate and communicate, that may be disrupted, and that may put extra stress on already threatened species. There's some other smaller issues as well. But broadly speaking, the plume, the noise are the main points of concern, and the direct disruption of the ecosystem being mined, because animals do grow on the nodules, and there are animals that grow on the nodules that don't grow anywhere else.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, in the beginning when you were talking about, this isn't something like an ore that has to be like hacked out of, all this sediment. It sounds like it would be somehow less environmentally impactful, but there are some pretty big impacts that we don't really fully understand yet. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I would also say that, if you were doing a one-to-one comparison between a cobalt mine on land versus a cobalt mine in the ocean, I think it'd be very hard to argue that the cobalt mine in the ocean was more environmentally destructive than the cobalt mine on land. And so, if we were starting with a fresh planet and had to extract X tons of cobalt from a brand new world and had to decide the best way to do that, or the least worst way to do it, would probably be a better way to phrase it, then I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue against going after polymetallic nodules versus going after terrestrial cobalt ores. But we're going after terrestrial cobalt ores. That's already happening. So deep sea mining is not going to replace that industry. It will be additive to that industry. So understanding how deep sea mining's impacts shape the ocean on its own, not looking at it as like a cost benefit versus terrestrial mining, I think is important, because the terrestrial mining will continue to happen.
So let's get into a little bit more of a policy conversation. And again, a lot of this is speculative, but with the terrestrial mining, one of the impacts is that that land is owned by somebody or something. And it's very clear who owns that land. And it's very clear where the proceeds go and all of that. And a lot of terrestrial mining takes place in areas that may be prone to conflict. Like there's a lot going on. When you talk about deep sea mining, who owns it? Who does it?
So depending on where you are, there are proposals to do deep sea mining in national waters. Those tend not to be particularly popular because they tend to be near where people can see it, and people have a little bit more possessive feelings about mining in their own waters. The vast majority of deep sea mining proposals are for what is called areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that is the seafloor in the high seas outside of any nation's borders. And those areas are overseen by the United Nations, and they are overseen and they fall under the purview of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has created a special entity called the International Seabed Authority, who's tasked with regulating the emerging deep sea mining industry. And so high seas mining is conducted under what's called a common heritage principle. So the question of who owns it is all of us. The mineral resources of the high seas are supposed to be exploited or protected for the good of humankind. And how you interpret the good of humankind kind of dictates how you approach whether people should have access to those minerals. But functionally speaking, you own those minerals, and I own those minerals, and the people of Ukraine own those minerals, and the people of China own those minerals, and the people of North Korea own those minerals, and they are a common heritage resource. And included on all that, future generations also own those minerals. So they are stakeholders whose future needs may need to be taken into consideration during the negotiation of regulations governing deep sea mining.
Where are we with these negotiations and conversations?
So we are entering the 30th or 31st year of negotiations. I can't keep track because they missed a year during the COVID pandemic. But the ISA has been negotiating the regulations for mining deep sea resources since the early 1990s. 1994 was when the entity came into existence. And they have made very slow but very steady progress on those regulations. So the first major hurdle to overcome was in the mid-2000s, producing the regulations that allow for the exploration of these resources. And the ISA uses its own technical terms for things. Exploration is basically prospecting. It's identifying ore bodies, doing the initial work you need to know if it's worth mining, doing the initial environmental impact assessments before you have permission to go in and actually mine. So all of the permitting regulations for the exploration phase were established in the mid to late thousands. And now we are currently in the process of negotiating the permits for exploitation, which is the actual commercialization of the industry. And it is a very difficult kind of thing to negotiate. For one, nothing like this has ever really been established yet in the history of international negotiations. Like we have very rarely have we tackled ownership over a common heritage resource like this. And we've never tackled commercialization of a common heritage resource before. And so it's new grounds in a lot of ways. And so because of that, it's kind of a very slow process, but there are certainly interested parties and interested stakeholders who are pushing it forward and who want to see commercialization of the high seas happen sooner rather than later, as well as stakeholders and nations who don't want to see it happen. So within the confines of a UN negotiation, it's been pretty intense.
So you said we've never had a common heritage commercialization opportunity like this before. So we don't actually even know what this would look like to divide out the proceeds of this by what every person on the planet. How does that work?
So that's actually the really tricky bit. So a lot of times when we talk about deep sea mining, people are very concerned about the environmental impacts and making sure the environmental regulations are correct. And that is all incredibly important. And my impression from watching these negotiations for the last 5 years is that we are very slowly circling around a set of environmental regulations that they won't make anyone happy, but everyone will kind of begrudgingly consent to, which is kind of what you want out of a major international negotiation. The financial regime for this is a much, much trickier beast because, like you said, we've never done this before. We've never split the proceeds for a common heritage resource, and we don't really have precedent for how to do that equitably and how to do it in a way that's going to keep the majority of stakeholders happy. So right now, there are debates happening in the ISA about the effective tax rate for deep sea mining companies, about the environmental fund and whether or not it has to be pre-funded before anyone gets to mine or whether that gets funded from proceeds, which is itself a really new and interesting thing. Because usually what happens is, an industry goes in, it does some environmental harm, we figure out what that harm was, and then a nation or a government or a local or state agency will have to sue them to get reparations to pay for any kind of remediation. But there's discussion within the ISA of having a pre-funded environmental fund so that you don't have to go after that company because they've already funded the remediation fund ahead of time, which is very valuable. If, a disaster causes a company to go bankrupt, then who do you collect funds from to do remediation? There's questions of if you are a developing country that has a terrestrial mining industry, if your industry is adversely impacted by deep sea mining, there are provisions within the law of the sea that says you have to be compensated. And how that compensation works and who funds it is up for discussion and is currently being hammered out. And I think, in terms of the actual negotiation points that have stakeholders within the International Seabed Authority at loggerheads, I think the financial regime is a much, much trickier kind of beast than the environmental regulations.
So with that in mind, you said it's been 30 years of negotiations. What do you think might happen next? Is there any kind of time frame for this actually going into play?
So there is a sort of ticking clock that may not be a ticking clock, but there were provisions within the law of the sea that said, if a country was ready to mine, if they were sponsoring a mining company and the technology was there and everything was ready to go, and the only thing holding things up was the negotiation, then they had the right to submit a plan of work to be considered by the ISA in light of whatever the current standing standards and best practices were. And so there is one company that has indicated that it's going to kind of pursue this. And in that case, there's a 2-year countdown. So the ISA has to make a decision within 2 years, either get the regulations done or approve or reject that plan of work. And there's one company they did submit an early plan of work or an intention to do a plan of work. And there is now rumblings that at the next assembly meeting this summer, they will submit that plan of work and start the clock again. So there is a time element that can come into play. But the reality of that is that I think that that's an important political move in terms of keeping people aware of the negotiations, in terms of making sure that the negotiations aren't being stalled in bad faith. And I think that is valid and important. But I think the reality is if you're a private company and you don't know what the effective tax rate is, or how much you're going to have to pre-fund an environmental fund, or what kinds of reparations you'll have to make to countries if you adversely impact their terrestrial industries. If none of that financial stuff has been hammered out, I can't imagine a commercial firm would want to start going into large-scale commercialization with that kind of unknown, because the negotiation for the tax rate has ranged from everything from 2% to 43%, which is a tremendous, there's so many unknowns in terms of projecting future profits that I think it'd be very difficult to want to go into that before that financial regime is hammered out and has much more clarity.
So in all, it sounds like on all fronts here, we're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but I think a good faith effort on the part of most stakeholders is driving the negotiations forward. It's not stalled. It's slow, but it's progressing slowly. And I think it's probably likely that the actual mining regulations, depending on how the next year of negotiations shake out, I think 2 to 3 years is a reasonable time frame for seeing those regulations start to actually take form and start seeing votes on whether or not to approve the regulations. That could all change. UN negotiations are pretty volatile and the world is pretty volatile right now. It's really hard to predict where we're going next.
So we could potentially see broken ground within 5 years.
I think that's fair to say. I think it is fair to say we could see broken ground within 5 years. And even once the regulations are approved, there's time between that and the beginning of commercialization because there's a whole lot of things that have to happen between the approval of the regulations and the issuing of the first mining permits. And then there's a lot of things that have to happen between the issuing of the first mining permits and actually getting out to sea and commercializing the resources. And one of the big X factors in all of this is that, these are critical minerals that we need predominantly for electric vehicle production. But battery chemistry for electric vehicle production is evolving, and it's evolving very quickly. And there are things like solid-state batteries coming online, sodium batteries coming online. Many car companies are switching to lithium iron phosphate batteries, which do not use cobalt and nickel in the same volumes. And so, that demand curve that is really driving the industry forward, that may change over the next 5 years as well. And so it really is, it's an exciting moment to be following the industry, and it's an exciting moment to kind of see where human innovation leads.
Well, Andrew Thaler, thank you so much for laying this out for us. This has been a fascinating conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.